Today is June 19th, better known as Juneteenth, and that is the newest federally recognized holiday in the U.S. But the history of that holiday goes back a long, long way, more than a century and a half to 1863. That's when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in the Confederacy and signaling the coming end of slavery in the U.S. overall. But freedom was not instant for the millions of enslaved African Americans at that time. Took more than 2 years, in fact, after the signing for the news to slowly make its way all the way down to Galveston, Texas. And that date when it arrived, June 19th, 1865, Juneteenth. The annual celebration of that day in 1865 is the holiday we are marking today as a nation. And then, after more than 150 years of Juneteenth being celebrated, it was at last federally recognized. That was back in 2021. It's new, so let's talk about it, how it became a holiday, its significance. Clint Smith of The Atlantic and the author of the best-selling book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, joins us now to talk about it. He's also got an adaptation for young readers, which is out on September 30th, and as I mentioned, does his day-to-day work over at The Atlantic magazine. Clint, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a new holiday for a lot of Americans. It's only 4 or 5 years old. What's the significance of it getting this federal recognition, and how do you think it should be marked?
Yeah, it's incredibly important that the holiday's been sanctioned as a federal holiday. What it does is reflect the work and the advocacy of activists, and specifically Black activists in Texas, over the course of many, many generations who've been celebrating this holiday, who've been recognizing this holiday, and the fact that it is now a federal holiday and is more well known across the country and the world is an important thing. At the same time, Juneteenth has never needed to be federally sanctioned in order for it to be considered legitimate. Black people, Black Americans have been celebrating Juneteenth for generations, for decades, in their homes, in their basements, when it was not safe for them to come out, when it was not safe for them to celebrate outside because of fear of violent attacks or lynchings. And so it is important that it is a federal holiday and that we have the opportunity to commemorate it in a meaningful way. And also, what we know is that the whims of politics shift back and forth over time. And so we're now in a moment of backlash and retrenchment. And we don't know what the future of Juneteenth as a federal holiday would look like. But regardless of if it is sanctioned or not sanctioned, it is a moment to recognize and celebrate and commemorate this history.
You know, Clint, I think for many people, right, slavery is a very difficult subject. You want to honor the reality of those experiences without othering someone. I mean, why do you think it's important that we don't downplay the reality of this in our history as America?
Oh, it's profoundly important. America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here or one over there. You get to pick this one and not pick that one. You have to hold both of those realities alongside one another. And when we think about somebody like Thomas Jefferson, right, somebody we consider the intellectual founding father of this country, the third president of the United States, he is somebody who sort of embodies that cognitive dissonance. He is someone who at once wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that Black people were inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. And so I say that because America has a history of complexity, of contradictions, of cognitive dissonance. And I think it's incredibly important for us in the context of slavery, in the context of Jim Crow, in the context of how we treated immigrants, in the context of the LGBTQ movement, for us to hold all of the contradictions of America's promise and America's reality alongside one another.
But Clint, you're touching on something so interesting and I think important because this is a new holiday. It raises a question of how white Americans should engage with it because, as you point out, you've got this history of slavery that benefited white America, but you also, with the Emancipation Proclamation, with the Civil War, with abolitionist movements that go all the way back to the founding of the country, you have a lot of white Americans who are on the side of what we all now recognize as the side of good and what always should have been. So how do white Americans engage with it? Do they engage with the sin, or do they also take pride in the abolition movement that was multiracial but had a lot of white input?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important that, as I just alluded to, that we have a both and understanding of America. And so, as you said, it is true that there were white Americans who were the central force of continuing to perpetuate the violence and indignity of slavery. And it is also true that abolition was a multiracial movement. I think what we have to do is recognize that sometimes in the context of these conversations, it can be suggested that Lincoln or benevolent white abolitionists sort of granted freedom to Black Americans, that they sort of handed it to them as a benevolent gesture. And I think that we can at once recognize the ways in which white Americans worked alongside enslaved people and free Black people without suggesting that they somehow gave it to them. Because what's true is that Black people, they arrived on these shores 1619. Slavery didn't end until 1865, but from the moment the enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for emancipation. They were fighting for liberation. And what that also means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway, because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about how my life is only possible, how my children's lives are only possible, because of generations of people who fought for something they knew they might never see, but who fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about what sort of responsibility does that bestow upon all of us, Black Americans, but also white Americans, all Americans, to try to build the sort of world that we might not necessarily be able to see ourselves, but to build it anyway because that's what was done for us.
Clint Smith, thank you for the important context on such an important conversation.